Hello, hi. So this is day three of the Discovery of India reading. Let's start. Chapter 2, Bidenweller Lausanne, Kamla. On September 4th, 1935, I was suddenly released from the mountain jail of Almora, for news had come that my wife was in a critical condition. She was far away in a sanctorium at Baden-Vallier, Allahabad. Baden-Vallier in the Black Forest of Germany. I hurried by automobile and train to Allahabad, reaching there the next day, and the same afternoon I started on an air journey to Europe. The airliner took me to Karachi and Baghdad and Cairo, and from Alexandria, a seaplane carried me to Brindisi. From Brindisi, I went by train to Basel in Switzerland. I reached Baden-Vallier on the evening of September 9th, 4 days after I had left Allahabad and 5 days after my release of Almora jail. There was the same old brave smile on Kamla's face when I saw her, but she was too weak and too much in a grip of pain to say much. Perhaps my arrival made a difference, for she was a little better the next day and for some days after. But the crisis continued and slowly drained the out of her. Unable to accustom myself to the thought of her death, I imagined that she was improving and that if she could only survive the crisis, she might get well. The doctors, as is their way, gave me hope. The immediate crisis seemed to pass, and she held her ground. She was never well enough for a long conversation. We talked briefly, and I would stop as soon as I noticed that she was getting tired. Sometimes I read to her. One of the books I remember reading out to her in this way was Pearl Burke's The Good Earth. She liked my doing this, but our progress was slow. Morning and afternoon, I trudged from my pension in the little town to the sanatorium and spent a few hours with her. I was full of the many things I wanted to tell her, and yet I had to restrain myself. Sometimes we talked a little of old times, old memories, of common friends in India. Sometimes wistfully of the future and what we would do then. In spite of her serious conditions, she clung to the future. Her eyes were bright and vital, her face usually cheerful. Odd friends who came to visit her were pleasantly surprised to find her looking better than they had imagined. They were misled by those bright eyes and the smiling face. In the long autumn evening, I sat by myself in my room in the pension where I was staying, or sometimes went out for a walk across the fields or through the forest. 100 pictures of Kamla succeeded each other in my mind, 100 aspects of her rich and deep personality. We had been married for nearly 20 years, and yet how many times she had surprised me by something new in her mental or spiritual makeup. I had known her in so many ways, and in later years I had tried my utmost to understand her. That understanding had not been denied to me, but I often wondered if I really knew her or understood her. There was something elusive about her, something pale, like real but unsubstantial, difficult to grasp. Sometimes, looking into her eyes, I would find a stranger peeping out at me. Except for little schooling, she had had no formal education. Her mind had not gone through the educational process. She came to us as an unsophisticated girl, apparently with hardly any of the complexes which are said to be so common now. She never entirely lost the girlish look, but as she grew into a woman, her eyes acquired a depth and a fire, giving the impression of still pools behind the storm raged. She was not the type of modern girl with a modern girl's habits and lack of poise, yet she took easily enough to modern ways. But essentially, she was an Indian girl, and more particularly a Kashmiri girl, sensitive and proud, childlike and grown up, foolish and wise. She was reserved to those she did not know or did not like, but bubbling over with gaiety and frankness before those she knew and liked. She was quick in her judgment and not always fair or right, but she stuck to her instinctive likes and dislikes. There was no guilt. Just a second. Child. Where was I? There was no guilt in her. If she disliked a person, it was obvious, and she made no attempt to hide the fact. Even if she had tried to do so, she would probably not have succeeded. I have come across few people who have produced such an impression of sincerity upon me as she did. Our marriage and after. I thought of the early years of our marriage, when, with all my tremendous liking for Kamala, I almost forgot her and denied her in so many ways that comradeship which was her due. For I was then like a person possessed, giving myself utterly to the cause I had espoused, living in a dream world of my own, and looking at the real people who surrounded me as substantial shadows. I worked to the utmost of my capacity, and my mind was filled to the brim with the subject that engrossed me. I gave all my energy to the cause and have little left to spare. And yet I was very far from forgetting her, and I came back to her again and again as to a sure haven. If I was always away for a number of days, the thought of her cooled my mind, and I looked forward eagerly to my return home. What indeed could I have done if so have been there to comfort me and give me strength, and thus enabled me to recharge the exhausted battery of my mind and body? I have taken from her what she gave me. What had I given to her in exchange during these early days? I had failed evidently, and possibly she carried the deep impress of the days upon her. With her inordinate pride and sensitiveness, she did not want to come to me to ask for help, although I could have given her that help more than anyone else. She wanted to play her own part in the national struggle and not be merely a hanger on and a shadow of her husband. She wanted to justify herself on her own self as well as to the world. Nothing in the world could have pleased me more than this. But I was far too busy to see beneath the surface, and I was blind to what she looked for and so ardently desired. And then prison claimed me so often, and I was away from her. Or else she was ill. Like Chitra in Tagore's play, she seemed to say to me, I am Chitra, no goddess to be worshipped, nor yet the object of common pity, to be bruised aside like a moth with indifference. If you deign to keep me by your side in the path of danger and daring, if you allow me to share the great duties of your life, then you will know my true self. Oh my God, woman empowerment बहुत अच्छी लाइन है ये. I am Chitra. But she did not say this to me in words, and it was only gradually that I read the message on her eyes. In the early months of 1930, I sensed her desire and she worked together, and I found in the experience a new delight. We lived for a while on the edge of life, as it were, for the clouds were gathering and a national upheaval was coming. Those who were pleasant months for us, but they ended so soon, and early in April, the country was in the grip of civil disobedience and governmental repression, and I was in prison again. Most of us men folks were in prison, and then a remarkable thing happened. Our women came to the front and took charges of the struggle. Women have always been there, of course, but now they are an avalanche to them. avalanche of them, which took not only to the British government but their own menfolk by surprise. Here were the women of the upper or middle class, leading sheltered life in their homes, peasant women, working class women, rich women, pouring out in their tens of thousands in defiance of government order and police lathi. It was not only that display of courage and daring, but what was even more surprising was the organizational power they showed. Never can I forget the thrill that came to us in Nani prison, where news of this reached us, the enormous pride of the women of India that filled us. We could hardly talk just a second, about our among ourselves, for our hearts were filled and our eyes were dim with tears. My father had joined us later in Nani prison, and he told us much that we did not know. He had been functioning outside as the leader of the civil disobedience movement, and he has encouraged in no way these aggressive activities of the women all over the country. He disliked, in his paternal and somewhat old fashioned way, young women and old messing about in the streets under the hot sun of summer and coming into conflict with the police. But he realized the temper of the people and did not discourage anyone, not even his wife and daughter in law. He told us how he have been agreeably surprised to see the energy, courage, and ability displayed by women all over the country. Of the girls of his own household, he spoke with affectionate pride. A father's insistent, at father's instance, a resolution of remembrance was passed at thousands of public meetings all over the India on 26 January 1931 as anniversary of India's Independence Day. These meetings were banned by the police and many of them were forcibly broken up. Father has organized this from his sick bed, and it was a triumph of organization. For we could not use the newspaper or the mail or the telegraph or the telephone or any of these established printing press. And yet, at a fixed time on the identical day over the vast country, even in remote villages, the resolution was read in the language of province and adopted. 10 days after resolution was so adopted, father died. The resolution was a long one, but a part it related to the women of India. We record our homage and deep admiration for the womanhood of India, who, in the hours of peril for the motherland, forsook the shelter of their home and with unfailing courage and endurance stood shoulder to shoulder with their menfolk in the front lines of India's national army to share with them the sacrifice and triumphs of struggle. In this upheaval, Kamla have played a brave and notable part, and on her inexperienced shoulders fell the task of organizing our works in the city of Allahabad, when even known workers were in prison. When every known worker was in prison, she made up for that inexperience by her fire and energy, and within few months she became the pride of Allahabad. We met again after the shadow of my father's last illness and his death. We met on the new footings of comradeship and understanding. A few months later, when we went with our daughter to Ceylon, Sri Lanka, for our first brief holiday and our last, we seemed to have discovered each other anew. All the past years that we have passed together had been but a preparation for this new and more intimate relationship. We came back all too soon, and work claimed me, and later prison. There was to be no more holidaying, no working together, not even being together except for a brief while, because two long prison terms of 2 years each followed each other. Before the second of these was over, Kamala lay dying. When I was arrested in November 1934 on the Calcutta warrant, Kamla went up to our room to collect clothes for me. I followed her to say goodbye to her. Suddenly she clung to me and fainting collapsed. This was unusual for her, as we have trained ourselves to take the jail going lightly and cheerfully, and to make a little fuss about it as possible. What it some was it some premonition she had that this was our last more or less normal meeting? Two long prison terms of 2 years each had come between me and her when our need for each other was greatest. Just when we had come so near to each other, I thought of this during the long days in jail, and yet I hoped the time would surely come when we would be together again. How did she fare during these years? I can guess, but even I do not know, for during jail interviews or during a brief interval outside, there was little normality. We had to be always on our best behavior lest we might cause pain to the others by showing our own distress. But it was obvious that she was greatly troubled and distressed over many things, and there was no peace in her mind. I might have been of some help, but not from jail. The problem of human relationship. All these and many other thoughts came to my mind during my long solitary hours in bed and Vellore. I did not shed the atmosphere of jail easily. I had long got used to it, and the new environment did not make any great change. I have lived in the Nazi domain with all its strange happenings, which I disliked so much, but Nazism did not interfere with me. There were few evidences of it in that quiet village in the corner of the Black Forest. Or perhaps my mind was full of other matters. My past life unrolled itself before me, and there was always Kamla standing by. She became a symbol of Indian woman and of woman herself. Sometimes she grew curiously mixed up with my ideas of India and the land that land of ours so dear to us, with all her faults or weaknesses, so elusive and so full of misery. What was Kamala? Did I knew her? Understand her real self? Did she know of or understand me? For I too am abnormal person with mystery and unplumbed depth within me, which I could not myself fathom. Sometimes I had thought that she was a little frightened of me because of this. I had been and was a most unsatisfactory person to marry. Kamla and I were unlike each other in some ways, and yet in some other ways were very alike. We did not complement each other. Our very strengths became a weakness in our relationship to each other. There could either be complete understanding, a perfect union of mind, or difficulties. Neither of us could live a humdrum domestic life accepting things as they were. Amongst the many pictures that were displayed in the bazaars in India, there was one containing two separate pictures of Kamala and me side by side, with the inscription on the top, Adarsh Jodi, the model or ideal couple, or so many people imagined us to be. But the ideal is terribly difficult to grasp or to hold. Yet I remember telling Kamla during our holidays in Shillong how fortunate we have been in spite of difficulties and differences, in spite of all tricks life have played upon us. The marriage was an odd affair, and it had not ceased to be so even after thousands of years of experience. We saw around us the wreck of many of marriages, or what was no better, the conversion of what was bright and golden into dross. How fortunate we were, I told her, and she agreed, for though we had sometimes quarrelled and grown angry with each other, we kept the vital spark alight. And for each one of us, life has always unfolding new experiences and giving fresh insights into each other. The problem of human relationship, how fundamental it is. and how often ignored in our fierce argument about politics and economics. It was not so ignored in the old and wise civilization of India and China, where they developed patterns of social behavior which with all their faults certainly give poise to the individual. That poise is not in evidence in India today. But where is it in the countries of the West which have progressed so far in other dimensions? Or is poise essentially static as opposed to progressive changes? Must we sacrifice one for the other? Surely it should be possible to have union of poise and inner and outer progress, of the wisdom of the old and the science and the vigor of the new. Indeed, we appears to have arrived at a stage in the world's history where the only alternative to such a union is likely to be destruction and undoing of both. Christmas 1935. Just a second. Yeah. Christmas 1935. Kamla's condition took a turn for the better. It was not yet marked, but after the strain of the past week, we experienced great relief. She had got over that crisis and stabilized her conditions, and that is itself was a gain. This continued for another month, and I took advantage of it to pay a brief visit to England with our daughter Indra. I had not been there for 8 years, and many friends pressed me to visit them. I came back to Battenville and resumed the, the old routine. Winter had come, and the landscape was white with snow. As Christmas approached, there was a marked deterioration in Kamla's conditions. Another crisis has come, and it seemed that her life hung by a mere thread. During these last days of 1935, I plugged my way through snow and slush, not knowing how many days or hours she would live. The calm winter scenes with its mantle of white snow seemed so like the peace of cold death to me, and I lost all my past hopeful optimism. But Kamla fought the crisis also, and with amazing vitality survived it. She grew better and more cheerful and wanted us to take her away from Badenwiller. She was weary of the place, and another factor which made a difference was the death of another patient in the sanatorium who had sometimes sent flowers to her and once or twice visited her. That patient, he was an Irish boy, had been much better than Kamla and was even allowed to go out for walks. We tried to keep the news of his sudden death from her, but we did not succeed. Those who were ill, and especially those who have a misfortune to stay in a sanatorium, seems to develop a sixth sense which tells that much that is sought to be hid from them. In January, I went to Paris for a few days and paid another brief visit to London. Life was pulling at me again, and news reached me in London that I had been elected for the second time president of INC, which was to meet in April. I had been expecting this, as friends have forewarned me, and I had been discussing it with Kamala. It was a dilemma for me to leave her as she was or to resign from the presidentship. She would not have me resign. She was just a little better, and we thought that I could come back to her later. At the end of January 1936, Kamla left Badenweiler and was taken to a sanatorium near Lausanne in Switzerland. Death. Both Kamla and I liked the change to Switzerland. She was more cheerful, and I felt a little more at home in that part of Switzerland, which I knew fairly well. There was no marked change in her condition, and it seemed that there was no crisis ahead. She was likely to continue as she was for a considerable period, making perhaps slow progress. Meanwhile, the call of India was insistent, and friends there were pressing me to return. My mind grew restless and even more occupied with the problems of my country. For some years, I have been cut off by prison or otherwise from active participation in public affairs, and I was straining at the leash. My visits to London and Paris and news from India have drawn me out of my shell, and I could not go back into it. I discussed the matters with Kamla and consulted the doctors. They agreed that I should return to India, and I booked my passage by the Dutch KLM airline. I was to leave Lorraine on February 28th. After all, this had been fixed up. I found that Kamla did not at all like the idea of my leaving her, and yet she would not ask me to change my plans. I told her that I would not make a long stay in India and hoped to return after 2 or 3 months. I could return even earlier if she wanted me. A cable would bring me by air or with her within a week. 4 or 5 days remained before the date fixed of my departure. Indra, who was at school at Bex nearby, was coming over to spend these last days with us. The doctor came to me and suggested that I should postpone my return by a week or 10 days. More he would not say. I agreed immediately and made another reservation in a subsequent KLM plane. As these last days went by, a subtle change seemed to come over Kamla. The physical condition was much the same, as far as we could see, but her mind appeared to pay less attention to her physical environment. She would tell me that someone was calling her, or that she saw some figure or shape entering the room when I saw none. Early on the morning of February 28th, she breathed her last. Indra was there, and so was our faithful friend and constant companion, Dr. M. Atal. A few other friends came from neighboring towns in Switzerland, and we told her or to the crematorium we took her to the crematorium in Lausanne. Within a few minutes, that fair body and the lovely face which used to smile so often and so well was reduced to ashes. A small urn containing the mortal remains of one who had been vital, so bright and so full of life. Mussolini returns. The bond that kept me in Lausanne and Europe was broken, and there was no need for me to remain there any longer. Indeed, something else within me was also broken, the realization of which only came gradually to me. For those days were black days for me, and my mind did not function properly. Indra and I went to Montreux to spend a few quiet days together. During our visit to Montreux, I had the visit from the Italian consul at Lausanne, who came over especially to convey to me that Shingor Mussolini's sympathy at my loss. I was a little surprised, for I had not met Shingor Mussolini or had any other contacts with him. I asked the consul to convey my gratitude to him. Some weeks earlier, a friend in Rome has written to me to say that Shingor Mussolini would like to meet me. There was no question of my going to Rome then, and I said so. Later, when I was thinking of returning to India by air, that message was repeated, and there was a touch of eagerness and insistence upon it. I wanted to avoid this interview, and yet I had no desire to be discourteous. Normally, I might have got over my distaste for meeting him, for I was curious also to know what kind of man the deuce was. But the Abyssinian campaign was was being carried on them, and my meeting him was inevitably have led to all manners of inferences and would be used for fascist propaganda. No denial from me would go far. I knew of several recent instances when Indian students and others visited Italy, have been utilized against their wishes and sometimes even without their knowledge for fascist propaganda. And then there have been the bogus interview with Mr. Gandhi, which the Gomial de Etele published in 1931. I conveyed my regrets, therefore, to my friend and later wrote again and telephoned to him to avoid any possibility of misunderstanding. All this was being before Kamla's death. After her death, I sent another message pointing out that even apart from other reasons, I was in no mood then for interview with anyone. All these instances of my part became necessary as I was passing through Rome by the KLM and would have to spend evening and night there. I could not avoid the passing visit and brief stay. After a few days at Montreux, I proceeded to Geneva and Marseille, and where I boarded the KLM airliner for the East. On arrival in Rome in the last afternoon, I was met by a high official who handed me the letter from the chief de cabinet of Singor Mussolini. The Deuce, it stated, would be glad to meet me and he had fixed 6 o'clock that evening for the interview. I was surprised and reminded him of my previous message, but he insisted that it was now all been fixed up and the arrangement would not be upset. Indeed, if the interview did not take place, there was even likelihood of his being dismissed from his office. I was assured that nothing would appear in the press and I need only see the deuce for a few minutes. All that he wanted to do was to shake hands with me and to convey personally his condolences at my wife's death. So we argued for a full hour with all courtesy on both sides, but with increasing strain, it was more exhausting over for me and probably more so for the other party. The time fixed for the interview was at last upon us, and I had my way. A telephone message was sent to Duke's Palace that I could not come. The evening I sent the letter to Shingo Mussolini expressing my regrets that I could not take advantage of his kind invitation to me to see him and thanks him for his message of sympathy. I continued my journey at Cairo. There were some old friends to meet me, and then further east, over the deserts of West Asia. Various incidents and the arrangements necessary for my journey had so far been kept my mind occupied. But after leaving Cairo and flying hours after hours over the desolate desert area, in terrible loneliness gripped me, and I felt empty and purposeless. I was going back alone to my home, with which no longer, which was no longer home for me. And there was by my side was a basket, and the basket contained an urn. That was all that remained of Kamala, and all our bright dreams were also dead and turned into ashes. She was no more. Kamala is no more. My mind kept on repeating. I thought of my autobiography, that record of my life, and which I had discussed with her as she laid in Bhuvali Sanatorium. And as I was writing it, sometimes I would take a chapter or two and read it out to her. She had only seen or heard or a part of it. She would never see the rest, nor would we write any more chapters together in a book of life. When I reached Baghdad, I sent a cable to my publisher in London who was bringing out my autobiography, giving them the dedication for the book to Kamla, who is no more. Karachi came and crowds with many familiar faces, and then Allahabad, where we carried the precious urn with the swift following of Ganga and poured the ashes into the bosom of the noble river. How many of our forebears she have carried thus to the sea? How many of those who follow us will take the last journey to the embrace of her water? And that was it for today. See you tomorrow.